For a second, I thought the photo was mislabeled. The caption said Saint Petersburg, but the street felt too familiar. Long stone facades, tall windows stacked like a grid, iron balconies cutting across the buildings, a wide avenue pulling the eye forward, like the city was built to make you look in one direction. Then I checked the other photo. Paris. Same rhythm, same confidence, same cold. Imperial order. That is where the problem starts. Because these cities are not neighbors. Paris and St. Petersburg sit more than 1,300 miles apart, farther than driving from New York City to Miami. One grew along the Seine. The other rose from the wet, frozen edge of the Neva. Different climate, different empire, different story. So why does the street language feel almost the same? Maybe it is just European style. Maybe, but when distance, stone, symmetry, and power all line up this cleanly, it stops feeling like decoration. It starts feeling like the city is trying to tell us something. Paris was not always the Paris people put on postcards. Start at Rue de Rivoli, near the Louvre, then move toward the Tuileries. Look at the long stone line, the repeated windows, the balconies cutting across the facade like black rails. It feels old. But that version of Paris was not simply born. It was forced into shape. In the mid-1800s, under Napoleon III, Baron Haussmann was given a job that almost sounds impossible. Open the city, cut through it, straighten it, make it breathe. From 1853 to 1870, Paris changed so violently that old neighborhoods disappeared under new lines drawn across the map. This was called urban planning. But on the map, it looks more like surgery. Boulevard Sebastopol pushed a clean north-south line through the center. Boulevard Saint-Michel cut through the Latin Quarter. Boulevard Haussmann carried the new rhythm westward. And Avenue de l'Opéra created a direct visual path toward Palais Garnier. These were not small street repairs. The first phase added about 6 miles of new boulevards. The second phase planned more than 16 miles of roads and avenues. Then the numbers get heavier. Around 19,700 buildings were demolished. Around 34,000 new buildings were constructed. But here's the detail that bothered me. The new Paris did not look random. It looked synchronized. Same pale stone. Same height lines. Same iron balconies. Same stacked windows. Block after block. Street after street. From Rue de Rivoli to Boulevard Haussmann, the city began repeating itself. Officially, this was about air, light, traffic, hygiene, and modernization. And maybe it was. But when a city is cut open, rebuilt, and given one face, you have to ask, was Paris only being improved? Or was something older being covered by a cleaner, more obedient version? Because once I saw that pattern in Paris, St. Petersburg stopped looking like a coincidence. St. Petersburg does not begin like a normal city. It begins like a decision. A ruler points to a cold, wet edge of Europe and says, build it here, not on easy land, not on warm hills, not beside an old capital, but on the mouth of the Neva River, near the Gulf of Finland, where water, mud, ice, and fog already owned the ground. In 1703, Peter the Great started St. Petersburg there, and that detail matters. Because this was not just a town growing slowly around a market. This was a capital being placed onto a difficult landscape. Look at Hare Island, where the Peter and Paul Fortress was founded. Look across the Neva toward the future line of power. The Admiralty, the Winter Palace, Palace Square, the long pull of Nevsky Prospect. These names do not feel random. They feel positioned. St. Petersburg was built across islands, canals, and embankments. Yet it still carries the confidence of a city that already knew what it wanted to become. UNESCO calls it the Venice of the North. More than 400 bridges cross its waterways. But this is not the soft romance of Venice. This city feels colder, sharper, more official. A water city wearing an imperial uniform. And that is what made me stop. How does a city built on wet northern ground begin speaking so quickly in stone, columns, palaces, and perfect sightlines? How does a place fighting mud and ice end up with architecture that feels planned for ceremony? Maybe the answer is Peter's ambition. Maybe it is European influence. Maybe it is just empire doing what empire does. But when I trace the line from Peter and Paul Fortress to Palace Square, then toward Nevsky Prospect, I do not see a city wandering into history. I see a map following instructions. You do not notice it from the map first. You notice it when you walk. In Paris, it starts quietly. You step out near the Louvre. Tourists are taking photos. Buses move along the street. Café chairs face the sidewalk like they have been waiting there for 100 years. Then you look down Rue de Rivoli, and something strange happens. The buildings do not feel separate anymore. They line up. Same pale stone. Same tall windows. Same iron balconies. Same roofline moving with you as you walk. It feels beautiful, but also controlled. Like the street is not just letting you pass. It is guiding you. You keep moving toward the Tuileries garden. The trees open. The air gets wider. Then suddenly, the city stretches forward. Place de la Concorde. The long pull of Champs-Élysées. The Arc de Triomphe waiting in the distance. If you are just a tourist, it feels grand. If you are paying attention, it feels designed to make you feel small. Now go to Saint Petersburg. Stand near the Admiralty on a cold morning. The air is sharper. The light is flatter. The Neva is close. You hear traffic. Footsteps. Maybe the wind moving across the wide open space. Then you look toward Nevsky Prospect. It runs for about 2.5 miles through the city. At street level, you do not experience it as a number. You experience it as a pull. Shops, churches, bridges, canals, façades, one scene after another. But the rhythm stays strangely formal. You pass near Kazan Cathedral. Its curved colonnade opens toward the street like a stone arm. You cross canals. You see old façades reflected in the water. You keep walking, and the city keeps arranging itself in front of you. Then comes Palace Square, and everything changes. The space opens so suddenly that it almost feels unreal. The Winter Palace spreads across one side in green, white, and gold. The Alexander Column rises in the middle, more than 155 feet tall. People look tiny beneath it. Cameras go up. Voices get softer. That is the power of the place. It does not need to explain itself. It makes your body understand. And that is where Paris and St. Petersburg begin to feel connected. Not because every building looks exactly the same. They do not. Paris feels warmer. St. Petersburg feels colder. Paris feels like pale stone under cafe light. St. Petersburg feels like imperial stone under northern sky. But both cities know how to move you. They use streets like corridors, squares like stages, monuments like final sentences. In Paris, Avenue de l'Opéra pulls your eyes toward Palais Garnier. At Place de l'Étoile, 12 avenues spread around the Arc de Triomphe like a giant stone compass. In St. Petersburg, Palace Bridge carries you across the Neva toward the old Imperial Center. Senate Square holds the bronze horseman, turning Peter the Great into a permanent shadow over the city. As a tourist, you think you are choosing where to look, but slowly, the city proves otherwise. It has already chosen the view. It has already placed the monument. It has already opened the square at the perfect moment. And maybe that is the real similarity. Not the windows, not the columns, not even the stone. The deeper pattern is control. Paris and St. Petersburg both know how to turn a walk into a ceremony. And once you feel that on the ground, the question becomes harder to ignore. Why do two cities, more than 1,300 miles apart, use the same silent method to guide a stranger's eyes toward power? At some point, the streets stop being enough. You can walk the boulevards. You can follow the sightlines. You can feel the city guiding your eyes. But then you stand in front of one building, and the question becomes heavier. Because some buildings do not look built only to be used. They look built to overwhelm. In Paris, that building is Palais Garnier. You reach it from Avenue de l'Opéra, and it does not appear quietly. It arrives like a curtain opening. Stone columns, golden statues, carved faces, arches, balconies, layers on top of layers, until the eye almost gets tired trying to read it. This opera house was started in 1861 and opened in 1875. That already matters, because it rises directly out of the same Paris that Haussmann was cutting open and rebuilding. It was not just placed in the city. It became part of this new city's performance. And inside, the building gets even stranger. The grand staircase is not just a staircase. It is a stage before the stage. People were meant to see each other there, to rise slowly, to be watched, to become part of the building's theater. Then there is the hidden part, under Palais Garnier. There is a famous underground water reservoir, often linked to the legend of the Phantom of the Opera. But before it became legend, it was engineering. Water beneath the theater, massive stage machinery, service corridors, hidden systems behind the beauty. That is the point. The decoration is what you notice first. The machine is what makes the building possible. Now move more than 1,300 miles northeast. Stand before the Winter Palace in Saint Petersburg. The color is different. The air is different. The mood is colder. But the feeling is familiar. The palace stretches along Palace Embankment beside the Neva, facing Palace Square like a wall of imperial memory. It served as the official residence of the Russian rulers from 1732 until 1917. Think about that. Almost 2 centuries of power behind one facade. And the numbers do not feel normal. About 1,500 rooms, nearly 2,000 windows, more than 100 staircases, a main facade around 500 feet long. That is longer than 1.5 football fields. A tourist sees a palace, but when you slow down, you start seeing logistics. How many workers kept those rooms heated? How much wood, coal, fabric, glass, paint, stone, and metal moved through those doors? How many servants knew the back corridors better than the royal halls? How many hidden routes sat behind the public face? Again, the building becomes 2 things at once. A symbol in front, a system behind. And that is where Paris and St. Petersburg start lining up again. Palais Garnier is not just an opera house. Winter Palace is not just a palace. Both are giant public messages wrapped around hidden machinery. One performs culture, one performs empire. But both use the same trick. Make the outside beautiful enough to silence questions. Make the scale large enough to make people feel small. Make the details rich enough that no one asks how the system underneath really worked. Maybe this is just what empires build. Maybe power always wants stone, gold, columns, and impossible rooms. But when the same pattern appears in 2 cities this far apart, beauty stops being the answer. Beauty becomes the cover. I did not want to bring up Tartaria too early. That is the kind of name that changes the room. Say it too soon, and people stop looking at the evidence. They start choosing sides. Believer, skeptic, conspiracy, history. So I left the name outside the door for as long as I could. I stayed with the streets, the facades, the bridges, the sightlines, the numbers. Paris, cut open between 1853 and 1870. Saint Petersburg, founded in 1703 on the wet northern edge of the Neva. One city rebuilt, one city placed, more than 1,300 miles apart. And still, they kept speaking in the same visual language. Stone fronts, long avenues, tall windows, classical columns, grand squares, buildings that feel less like shelter and more like instructions. That is when Tartaria starts to become useful, not as an answer, as a question. Because in official history, Tartary or Tartaria often appears on old European maps as a broad name for huge regions across northern and central Asia. A map label, a vague outside world, a place Europeans did not fully understand. That is the safe explanation, and maybe it is enough. But in the alternative history world, Tartaria means something else. It becomes a symbol, a possible trace of an older world, a world that may have been renamed, divided, absorbed, or explained away piece by piece. Now, I'm not saying Tartaria built Paris. I'm not saying Tartaria built St. Petersburg. That would be too easy and too careless. What I'm asking is colder than that. What if these empires were not inventing a language of power from nothing? What if they were inheriting one? Look at the pattern. Paris gets standardized under Haussmann. St. Petersburg rises as an imperial capital on difficult ground. Washington D.C. later uses long axes and neoclassical buildings to turn government into ceremony. New York gives us Grand Central Terminal, a Beaux-Arts machine for moving people through marble, light, and scale. Chicago fills its old downtown with stone facades, heavy ornament, and buildings that look far older in spirit than their construction dates. Buenos Aires becomes known as the Paris of South America because its streets, domes, balconies, and avenues feel strangely familiar to Europe. Different continents, different politics, different climates. Same feeling. That is the part I cannot ignore. Because if this is only style, why does it behave like a system? Why do the same pieces keep returning? The grand entrance, the oversized window, the impossible cornice, the dome, the column, the avenue aimed like a weapon, the square opened like a stage, the public building that seems designed not just to function, but to make the person standing below it feel smaller. Maybe the official answer is right. Maybe this is Rome, Greece, France, empire, trade, schools of architecture, rich patrons, and copied taste moving across the world. That explanation is real. It makes sense, but it still leaves a shadow. Because copied taste usually leaves variation. This feels more like a code different empires learn to use. And maybe that is why Tartaria keeps returning in these investigations. Not because the name solves everything, but because it gives a shape to the suspicion that the old world was not built in isolated pieces. The suspicion that some cities were not simply created, but overwritten. Paris may be one layer. Saint Petersburg may be another. The names changed. The flags changed. The rulers changed. But the stone kept the older grammar. And once you start reading that grammar, the map becomes uncomfortable. Because now every old city asks the same question. Who really wrote the first version? And this is where I had to stop pretending this was only about architecture. Because Paris and St. Petersburg do not prove everything. They do not prove a lost empire. They do not prove Tartaria built the old world. But they do leave something behind. A pressure. A pattern. A feeling that the official story explains the surface, but not the silence underneath it. Paris was cut open between 1853 and 1870. St. Petersburg was placed on the wet edge of the Neva in 1703. More than 1,300 miles apart. Different rivers, different rulers, different climates. And still, both cities learned to speak in stone the same way. Long avenues, formal squares, classical columns, buildings that do not simply stand there, but arrange the person looking at them. Maybe that is empire. Maybe that is taste. Maybe that is just the old language of power moving from one capital to another. But maybe the deeper question is not who copied whom. Maybe the deeper question is this. Why does the same language keep surviving every time the flags change? The rulers disappear. The maps are redrawn. The names are replaced. But the facades remain. The windows remain. The columns remain. The long streets still pull your eyes forward. As if the city remembers something the history books decided to simplify. And maybe that is all this investigation can do. Not give a final answer, but point to the stones and say, look again. Because once you see Paris and St. Petersburg this way, other cities start looking different too. Washington D.C., Vienna, Berlin, Chicago, Buenos Aires, different places, same old whisper. So if one detail in this story made you pause, the distance, the boulevards, the palaces, the hidden systems, or the name Tartaria, leave that word below. I want to know which clue stayed with you. Because the next map may be much larger than two cities.